Bureau of Labor Statistics, which releases all these critical reports, the jobs report, the inflation reports like CPI, the PPI, the PCE, they go on hiatus during the shutdown. So not only are they not releasing the data, this started in October, their data from September, because the people who are releasing it are out, they're also not collecting that data for the month of October to be released in November.
Pulling it all together, with tariffs possibly unconstitutional, a divided Fed, what other signs should consumers watch for in 2026 planning? How do you prioritize these in your stories to help everyday people? Well, welcome, Zach. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
So your article on the September jobs report highlighted 119,000 new jobs, better than expected, but with downward revisions to prior months and the unemployment rate ticking up to 4.4%. So it sounds as though this report was delayed as a result of the government shutdown. Did you face any other hurdles in gathering the results, and were you surprised by them?
I think I was, I wouldn't say surprised, just because we really didn't know what to expect. So to back up a little bit, this government shutdown had went on for over a month. It was the longest government shutdown in U.S. history. And during that time, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which releases all these critical reports, the jobs report, the inflation reports like CPI, the PPI, the PCE, they go on hiatus during the shutdown. So not only are they not releasing the data, this started in October, their data from September, because the people who are releasing it are out, they're also not collecting that data for the month of October to be released in November. So with that in mind, it's been, we just got this report now and it's from September. So we're not really sure. I mean, it gives a good sense of the state of the affairs in September, but really that might not be the reality right now at all. So kind of take all that with a grain of salt. I was a little bit surprised by the number being as high as it was. That's good news for the Trump administration, good news for the Federal Reserve. It's trying to shore up the labor market, make sure it stays healthy. But again, we go back to these downward revisions that we've had, not only in this jobs report, but several jobs reports, by hundreds of thousands cumulatively over the past year or so. So it makes taking these reports kind of difficult, because on one hand, yes, we're seeing positive jobs growth, but are we thinking, a month or two from now, we could see that revised down? So it's kind of it's a difficult situation to analyze. I think kind of all in all, it wasn't really a wash to one side or the other. It wasn't a huge upside surprise or a downside surprise, but really it's going to be important just to see the more recent jobs data as that starts to come out. And we just found out that the BLS won't be releasing the the October jobs report or the October CPI and PPI reports. Again, that's hard. That's going to make the Federal Reserve's life harder when they're deciding what to do at interest rates, because they're just not having the data that's supposed to be in front of them to make those decisions.
Did they say why they weren't going to release it?
It was just they weren't able to collect it because, one, the way these things work, for let's take the consumer price index, for example, the CPI report, it's the most closely tracked inflation report. To collect that data, they're going out and surveying consumers the month where the data is being collected. So they're going to someone and saying, hey, how much are eggs at the grocery store? How much is a gallon of milk today? And all that, those staffers were not working during the time when that was taken. And it's kind of hard to go back to someone and say, hey, do you remember in October 15th what you were paying for a carton of eggs? So yeah, it just makes it feasibly pretty impossible. There's some metrics that they can capture and release later, and they will be released in forthcoming reports. And that's like from companies that, have past data, and they store that on what products are priced what. But the biggest majority of the survey is the household survey, it's called, and they just weren't able to collect data from that.
I see. And sector breakdowns in your reporting were eye-opening. Manufacturing down 6,000 jobs, federal jobs down 97,000, but leisure and hospitality surging past pre-pandemic levels. What does this patchwork tell families planning holiday budgets about job stability heading into 2026?
I mean, it's kind of goes with the notion of this low hire, low fire economy. You're seeing, I think the federal job losses, that's some of that's from the Doge stuff, some of that's just from the state and local level. But yeah, but with the leisure and hospitality, it shows that the people are still going out, they're still spending money on things. They're not completely cutting back on travel and and that sort of thing. And if we kind of zoom into right now, I actually just did a story on this holiday season, and basically all the analysts kind of expect there to be muted growth. So the economy is still going to be expanding. People are going to still be spending more money than they spent last year on an like aggregate basis, but the growth is going to be much slower than in past years. And I think that's kind of what you see in these jobs reports for like leisure and hospitality. Yes, their sectors are growing. Yes, their sectors are contracting. Where you start to get really concerned is where you see multiple industries, multiple sectors start showing contractions instead of expansions. So, like I said, low hire, low fire. Many companies are not firing. You're not seeing these mass layoffs. There's some in the tech space, but you're not hearing every day about massive layoffs, but you're also not, if you're a job seeker, sometimes able to just go out and find a job like you were, in years past. And so it's kind of like treading water right now. And I hate to say it again, but it's sort of, we're in wait and see mode, really, what's going to come down the line.
I see. And over the weekend, you reported on Trump's quiet executive order rolling back tariffs on coconuts, citrus, teas, pineapples, and even some beef products beyond just bananas and coffee. So economists like Ryan Young called it surprisingly broad, possibly eyeing 2026 midterms with affordability top of voters' minds, with polls showing 63% of Americans thinking tariffs fuel inflation. Do these exemptions feel like a real win for consumers, or just a political band-aid after Democrats' off-year election gains?
So I think we need to start talking about this when you really look at the most recent election. Obviously, there were blue states. The caveat there, Republicans weren't necessarily considered polling expected to win any of these and many of these. But I think the margin of victory for Democrats was a wake up call for President Trump and for Republicans, especially because all these exit polls showed that the biggest concern for voters is still one, the economy, affordability, inflation, cost of living, the same things that got Trump into office back in 2024. And so I think there's been a renewed focus on that. And the other thing is, it's a debate on how much tariffs actually increase inflation. There's no real clearance to that. And you talk to one economist, he'll say one thing, talk to another, he'll say another thing. It's pretty universally understood that there is at least a one-time price increase when you raise tariffs because they have to be passed on in some fashion. But other economists will say that there's these massive inflation will be massively increased. So with that caveat alone, when he did these exemptions, a lot of these are for products that were not made in the United States and are not made or produced in the United States. So a good example is bananas. We just don't have the capacity to grow bananas here. And so when you slap a, 15, 20, whatever percent it is tariff on them, essentially there's no alternative. So the prices are going to rise by that amount. Coffee is another example. And if you look at under the hood on some of the CPI data, coffee prices have increased. I can't remember, but I believe it's between 10 and 20% in the past year alone. So I think a lot of these were designed to address those very narrow bands of products that we can't produce here domestically. But there are also, that's why you mentioned Ryan Young at CI. I think there was some surprise with that there were some items that are produced here, that are grown here. Off the top of my head, beef products, because we've been seeing beef inflation quite a bit. Citrus, or obviously we have orange growers in Florida, but it's an acknowledgement, I think, from the administration that they still want to pursue this tariff agenda. They still see it as very advantageous for the US in the long term to reshore manufacturing, that sort of thing. But there are concessions where, yes, we understand that some of these things are going up quicker than others, and we need to kind of take a little bit of a relief valve on some of those specific items. I don't know what to expect, whether or not we'll see more items exempted in the coming weeks and months. But I think regardless of that, you're going to see inflation and affordability become much bigger issues on the campaign trail for Republicans heading into the midterm elections. And I wouldn't be too surprised if you saw some Republicans in vulnerable districts kind of publicly backing away from the tariff agenda even more, given the exit polling that shows voters are connecting tariffs with affordability issues.
Interesting. And looking ahead, the Supreme Court is weighing the legality of Trump's tariffs after lawsuits from companies and states. So if they're struck down, what ripple effects could that have on prices and the economy?
I think it would really depend on a lot of factors. I don't think if tariffs are revoked by the Supreme Court, there'll be an immediate change that consumers would notice in any way. You've heard President Trump say several times that there's other means to reimpose tariffs under different statutes, under different codes, and those could then go to court. And it could be like a game of whack-a-mole when it comes to this. But I think more so the bigger concern for the administration is if these tariffs are rolled back, it's going to be kind of challenging to sell them, to the public. If the Supreme Court, which is, run by primarily people considered conservative that typically vote with or rule in the fashion the Republicans would like, I think it would be seen as kind of a repudiation at a national level from some of Trump's own appointees if they voted that way, that tariffs are not legal under APA. And so that could be a political minefield that Republicans will have to navigate heading into the midterms as well.
I see. And the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index hit 51 in November, the second lowest ever, worse than the Great Recession amid high inflation expectations and the shutdown. So how did you track this down from preliminary to final readings? And what role did Survey Director Joanne Shu's comments play in shaping your analysis of why consumers feel so frustrated despite the economy reopening?
Yeah, and I mean it's an interesting situation right now, right? It's lower than a lot of the points during the Biden inflation, where inflation was literally running at 9%. And, I mean, that's just generationally bad inflation. And it's worse than during the '08 financial crisis and the recession that followed. And that's a bit perplexing. But I think a lot of it has to do with not only consumers feeling like they're still having affordability issues even all these years after the great inflation started, after the pandemic. And I think it talks a little bit to the sentiment of what they expect to come. If you look at inflation expectations, it shows that people still expect inflation to be even higher in the long run. It's running at about 3% right now, which is about 1% higher than it should. But a lot of surveyed people expect it to go even higher because of tariffs and because of other things. I just think it's interesting because you're not seeing these mass layoffs, but people are still very dissatisfied. And I think that sort of dissatisfaction with the economy is going to be something that's going to be closely looked at by pollsters and by other, economic analysts going into next year, because it really, in some ways, just doesn't match the reality on the ground. We're not in a recession. Inflation has gone down. Like I said, it used to be at 9%. It's at 3%. Granted, it hasn't really changed on an annual basis over the past year. It was running about 3% this time last year. But it's much better than it was. And I think it's a very much an open question about why people are kind of feeling this way.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the Fed front, one of your articles describes a coin flip for a December rate cut with odds at 46% due to missing data on jobs and inflation. And so you spoke to insiders like former Fed President Dennis Lockhart about the hawk dove split. So was there anything else that stood out to you during that interview?
Yeah, I mean, he's an interesting guy to talk to because he's actually been in the room for these Federal Open Market Committee decisions. And he sort of broke down how right now it appears that there's a split on the FOMC where you have some, and again, getting back to the science of the Fed, or sort of science of Fed watching, is they never really, a lot of them are just really don't come out and just say, this is what needs to be done, or this is what I think. They'll hint at things. So you see Fed Chair Jerome Powell say, we shouldn't be fully on board for a cut. We could, and all these like caveats and asterisks. But if taken together, all these speeches recently, you're seeing some of the Fed members who seem very dovish, like they want to cut rates again in December because they're more worried about the employment side of things. So Fed has a dual mandate. On one hand, they need to keep prices low, keep inflation in check. And on the other hand, they want to make sure that the country has as full of employment as we can. Typically, when inflation is too high, they try to raise interest rates to squelch demand. And when the economy and the labor market starts slowing down, they tend to lower rates to encourage investment and job creation. And so right now we're sort of at a crossroads. You have half of the FOMC who's kind of thinks that we're more balanced to the inflation side of the equation, that inflation being at 3%, still running too hot. They're worried that if we cut interest rates more, it could cause more inflation. On the other hand, you see these, like we mentioned, the employment reports with the downward revisions. and other indications that the labor market's softening. And they're saying, look, if we don't start lowering rates right now, you could see us tip into a recession or start to see these bigger layoffs. So I think right now it's a fundamental split on the board about where they think the biggest issue is. Is it on the employment side? Is it on the inflation mandate? And it's gotten a little bit clearer what's going to happen. I wrote that story a few days back. We've seen some more speeches, and it appears now more likely that there will be another interest rate cut in December, which music to President Trump's ears, music to new Fed Governor Stephen Myron's ears, who's been pushing for half or 50 basis point cuts instead of 25. But again, it's still, I would say, about 80% odds that we'll see a rate cut. That's what the investors are pricing in right now. And I think that it's going to be very uncertain going forward after this December cut. I think Powell, if you really break it down, he's really in this wait and see mode where he wants to kind of just see where things go instead of making rash decisions, either one way or the other right now. And then another thing from my interview that you mentioned with Dennis was about kind of the role that Fed chair plays in all this. If there is a split decision like that, and say the board were kind of divided on whether to hold or whether to cut, he said that that's kind of the role that the Fed chair comes in, and he's the deciding vote, if you will, and a lot of members will defer to him, and they'll end up voting the direction of even if they weren't gonna before, they'll kind of lean into it because they want to show that their choice is more united. So you don't really ever see these big split decisions on the Fed where it says like 4 dissents or 5 dissents. You'll see at most 1 or 2 dissents because they will kind of defer to the Fed chair in these decisions where it goes either way. So it'll be interesting to see. We also I mentioned Stephen Myron, President Trump's pick for Fed governor, whose name has been in speculation for Fed chair, and along with several other people. Bullard on the board has also been his name's been thrown around, but he actually said, because he's been dissenting and preferring bigger rate cuts. So even though the Fed's cut the past two meetings by 25 basis points, he's been saying he wants 50 and not even voting for the 25 cut because he wants a 50 basis point cut. And he had said if he was the tie-breaking vote, he would then vote for a 25. So, it's anyone's ball game right now. But we'll see as it gets closer to the meeting where sort of the public statements from Fed members and where this interest rate decision sort of kind of evolves into.
Yeah, interesting. And President Trump's floated $2,000 tariff dividend checks for voters could cost $300 billion or more, but economists like Jason Furman warn that they'd add to inflation similar to Biden's stimulus. So how did you crunch the numbers on feasibility, and did you interview White House officials to clarify if this is checks, tax breaks, or something else?
So it's all very unclear. I'll start with that. I mean, this was an idea that was sort of released on social media, but there hasn't been concrete, the wheels haven't really been put in motion on this. So we don't know what if it would be in the form of a reback or like a check, or if we've never had a specific threshold level, as it can be anyone under 100,000 or anyone under 80,000, because President Trump did say that they want to do it for people who are not like super wealthy. So it's not going to be a check to everyone, that sort of thing. There's some concerns about this. If it used purely tariff revenue, then it wouldn't be as inflationary because it would be basically money from the tariffs going back in people's pockets. If they need the deficit spend on this, like Biden did right after the pandemic, where we were, just adding to the deficit, that could be inflationary and could actually hurt the overall inflation of the country in the longer term. In a shorter term, either way, I think it would help American families if they were to cut, $2,000 check. Obviously, that's going to help buy groceries, go to the supermarket in the short run. I think you need to weigh the longer term inflation concerns, because yes, it might help before an election year and might help right now, but if it increases inflation by a tenth or of a percentage point or more down the road, then overall it's just going to hurt in the longer term. So I think it's to me about balancing that. There's also the question of whether or not Congress would even have any appetite to do this, and it doesn't seem like me that they do. Some lawmakers I've talked to on background and stuff, they don't really seem excited about it, or like they're really chomping at the bit to get this passed. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is an idea that sort of falls to the wayside, but it does show that the affordability conversation is still top of mind for the Trump administration, and that they're going to be continuing to look for ways to help Americans afford groceries, afford staple items. And, I think that's really going to be the message of 2026 as we head toward the midterm elections.
Well, Zach, thank you so much for your insight into economic uncertainties heading into the holidays. We, of course, look forward to more of your reporting on the topic.